In early 1942, Japan's military might was at its zenith. The Empire's brazen and successful surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, galvanized the Japanese appetite for territorial conquest. Little did they know, they had awakened the sleeping giant. In 1942, that giant sprung into action. There was, of course, the Doolittle raid. This daring bombing adventure over Tokyo brought respect back to America. It also sent Japan a painful message that the Empire was not invincible, a message that became even clearer in the two critical Pacific campaigns of 1942. Midway was one of the most important naval battles in history. Fought from June 3rd to June 5th, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States dealt a devastating blow to the Imperial Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of her most powerful carriers and setting the stage for the beginning of the Empire's downfall. The Japanese notion of Sekai Daiichi, first in the world, received a deep reality check. Then, in August, fighting on land began. On what was a virtually unheard-of Pacific island, the United States shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility for good when United States Marines and Army halted the Japanese advance in its tracks. In 5 months of bitter fighting, the United States emerged victorious, and with a seasoned, battle-trained fighting corps that would go on to sweep the Japanese back across the Pacific, island by island. In a big and successful way, striking back was crucial to freedom across the world. Midway and Guadalcanal 1942 began that glorious march. In the history of war, there have been few military operations in which the trifling material damage inflicted on an enemy has been so totally outweighed by its attendant psychological impact and the ensuing strategic consequences, as in the Doolittle raid on Japan on the 18th of April 1942. The audacity of the raid served to demonstrate that, in spite of the remarkable victories that had been achieved by the Imperial Army and Navy in Southeast Asia since the outbreak of war, the United States remained capable of striking at the heart of the Japanese Empire, ridiculing the pretension that territorial conquest had in any way rendered the homeland inviolable. The Japanese nation's outrage at the raid was compounded by the loss of face experienced by the Imperial Navy. It saw its ability to exercise responsibility for the defense of the seas around Japan, and thereby ensure the safety of the Emperor, impugned. These sentiments were echoed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, whose own concern to prevent Tokyo being attacked from the air verged on the obsessional. One has the embarrassing feeling of having been caught napping just when one was feeling confident and in charge of things, he said. Even though there wasn't much damage, it is a disgrace that the skies of the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down. More significantly, while the Japanese authorities outwardly ridiculed the attack as the do-nothing or do-little raid, the collective disquiet of the Naval General Staff and the planners of the Combined Fleet was sufficient to end their irresolution concerning the detailed timetable appending the decision to launch Operation MI. On the 5th of May, Admiral Osami Nagano, the Chief of the Naval General Staff, issued Imperial GHQ Naval Order No. 18, instructing Yamamoto to carry out the occupation of Midway Islands and key points in the Western Aleutians. 1 month later, the Combined Fleet, convinced of certain victory, had put to sea the largest and most powerful naval force since Jutland. Nevertheless, it was to experience in the Battle of Midway a defeat so decisive as to doom itself and the cause of Imperial Japan to inevitable ruin. That such an outcome was even possible at a time when Japan's military success was at its zenith requires understanding of the strategic context governing decisions pertaining to future operations by the Combined Fleet in the months following Pearl Harbor. This, in turn, draws us to an appreciation of the central role in such planning played by Fleet Admiral Yamamoto, whose strategic perspective was fundamental in the provision of the rationale for the planning of and execution of Operation MI. On the first day of 1942, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki penned the following thoughts in his personal diary. It has been only 25 days since the war started, yet operations have been progressing smoothly, and we have enough reason to hope for the completion of the first stage of the war before the end of March. Then what will come next? That the Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet could utter such a question less than a month after his nation had plunged headlong into war with the United States and Great Britain speaks volumes for the lack of any long-term strategic vision appending that decision. The absence of such was not surprising, given that the motivations governing Imperial Japan's choice of war in December 1941 to resolve its economic problems hardly rested on any rational appraisal of the actual or potential forces she had chosen to oppose. Indeed, the need to secure oil supplies had become so central in driving the formulation of Japan's initial war strategy, and the risks attendant upon its realization so great, that little thought had been given by her strategists to what would follow when and if success was achieved. With a remarkable economy of force comprising 11 divisions, some 1,200 aircraft and most of the Navy, in the 100 days following Pearl Harbor, Japan proceeded to humble the military forces of the United States, Australia, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. By the end of March, as Ugaki had predicted, the Japanese had essentially achieved their initial war aims of securing control over the oil supplies of the Dutch East Indies and widening the defensive perimeter around the homeland. Furthermore, the material cost of achieving this had been extraordinarily low. Having allowed for fleet losses of at least 25%, the Navy lost only 23 vessels, amounting to barely 10% of the anticipated figure. In the 4 months in which Japan's armed forces had run rampant across the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, she had shown that her soldiers, sailors, warships and aircraft were equal, if not superior, to those of her despised and supposedly superior enemies. Consequently, few in Japan or in the armed forces would have disputed the view expressed by Ugaki in his diary entry at the onset of the new year. The future is filled with brightness. The course of events during this year will determine the fate of the war, so we must work hard, exerting every effort. The main thing is to win, and we surely will win. Translating these sentiments into reality was the task delegated to Ugaki by Admiral Yamamoto when told to begin the planning of second-stage strategy immediately. It was symptomatic of the relative ineffectualness of the Imperial General Headquarters, the body responsible for the formulation of the nation's war strategy, that Admiral Yamamoto, as head of the combined fleet, could abrogate this major task to himself. However, although the Imperial General Headquarters comprised the general staffs of the Army and the Navy under the supreme command of the Emperor, it was rent by a rivalry that never allowed the emergence of a coherent strategy governing the operations of both services. In reality, Imperial General Headquarters presided over two essentially distinct strategy-making bodies. The Army, as the senior of the two services, always perceived that its primary focus and Japan's true interests lay in China and the defense of Manchuria against a greatly feared Soviet threat. This focus meant that its support for the Southern strategy, which drove the conflict started on the 7th of December 1941, was heavily conditional on the degree to which it served the Army's interests in its primary theatre of operations in China, and on the limited number of Army divisions it was grudgingly prepared to employ in support of essentially naval operations in this new theatre of war. Compounding the Army's relative indifference to strategic questions beyond its own sphere of interest was the decline in the influence of the Naval General Staff and its command over the formulation of naval strategy, which passed in practice from itself to the planning staff of the combined fleet under Admiral Yamamoto. In part, this arose from the dynamic and powerful personality of the combined fleet commander, who held a low opinion of the abilities of his superior, the chief of the Naval General Staff. Admiral Nagano rarely involved himself in the formulation of naval staff strategy. He tended to leave it to the younger officers of the Plans Division of the 1st Operations Section under the command of Rear Admiral Fukudome. Consequently, his role increasingly became that of umpire when the views of combined fleet and his own Plans Division conflicted, as in the dispute before the Pearl Harbor operation, which was strongly opposed by members of his own staff. Nagano had given final approval to Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan, even though it was in his domain to reject it, in spite of the latter's threat to resign unless the General Staff accepted it. While this could be interpreted as acquiescence to blackmail, it was also deference on Nagano's part to one whose abilities he recognized as being indispensable to the Navy. In a most revealing observation, it was said, Nagano had the utmost confidence in Yamamoto's abilities and judgment. He finally agreed because he knew Yamamoto was not bluffing. If this seems strange, it must be remembered that Yamamoto's position and influence in the Japanese Navy were unique. He was in truth a leviathan among men. Given the success of the Pearl Harbor attack, it is therefore not surprising that his prestige was now such that the formulation of strategy by the combined fleet's staff officers under Yamamoto's guidance was tacitly presumed and accepted. This is not to suggest, however, that the Naval General Staff were simply prepared to acquiesce to Yamamoto designs. There remained in the Plans Division fertile minds who not only advocated their own strategy, but were prepared to fight their corner and, if necessary, oppose the demands of Yamamoto and his planning staff. Even so, as events were to show, it was a forlorn hope to believe that they could deflect the combined fleet commander from his chosen course once his mind was made up. When Ugaki emerged from his cabin on the 14th of January to present the outcome of his deliberations, he prefaced his recommendations with the crucial observation that Japan could not afford to rest on its laurels by consolidating on its initial conquests. To do so would hand over the initiative for the offensive, allowing the United States to increase its strength while Japan waited passively for the Americans to attack. Under such circumstances, the proven effectiveness and technical proficiency of the Imperial Navy would rapidly become a wasting asset. To capitalize on the strategic advantage created by the combined fleet in its initial war operations, it behoved Japan to resume the offensive. Governed by this rationale, Ugaki evaluated a number of operational possibilities. He finally proposed that Japan should seize the islands of Midway, Johnston and Palmyra with a view to transforming them into advanced air bases before an invasion of Hawaii. He argued that such an operation was likely to precipitate that decisive battle with the United States fleet that still lay at the core of Japanese naval strategy. His proposal was rejected by Captain Kuroshima, the senior fleet operations officer, because he doubted whether the United States would risk their fleet to save these islands. He then proffered his own recommendation, shifting the strategic focus of the combined fleet westwards towards the Indian Ocean, and an operation to seize Ceylon, presently Sri Lanka. Whilst accepting the critique of his own proposals and approving Kuroshima's, Ugaki insisted on the proviso that an Indian Ocean operation be carried out within the context of a joint Axis undertaking, with the Japanese second stage offensive timed to synchronize with German offensives in the Near and Middle East. What might have constituted a major strategic opportunity came to naught, however, when the Germans made no offer of joint operations in the new tripartite Axis military agreement signed on the 19th of December. Nevertheless, Combined Fleet continued to explore Kuroshima's proposal as a purely Japanese undertaking. Following war games on the new flagship Yamato in February, the Western operation was adopted by the Naval General Staff as the official naval proposal for Phase 2 strategy. It was presented as such to a joint conference at Imperial General Headquarters in mid-March, only to be scuppered by the Army when it became obvious that the operation depended upon the supply of more divisions for the amphibious attack on Ceylon. Remaining committed to the need for offensive action, Combined Fleet cast around for an alternative plan. It returned to Ugaki's initial proposal for action in the Eastern Pacific, reworked to exclude the possibility of an Army veto. The plan now evolved dropped the ambitious suggestion to invade Hawaii and required an invasion of the Western Aleutians and Midway Island. Not least among the factors shaping Combined Fleet's decision by this time were the decidedly unwelcome, though tactically insignificant, U.S. attacks on the Marshalls, Rabaul, Wake, Eastern New Guinea and Marcus Island from February onwards. With the last-named island only 1,000 miles from Tokyo, and within the outer ring of Japan's defences, the continued survival of the U.S. carriers allowed the Americans the option of using them for a strike on the homeland. This prospect obsessed the deeply patriotic Yamamoto, and the continued operation of the U.S. carriers threw into sharp focus the need to finish the work begun at Pearl Harbor by ensuring their belated destruction. This was the rationale for the Midway operation, and it is known that if it could be achieved, Yamamoto intended to use his undoubted prestige to press Japan's political leaders to make peace overtures to the Allies. Yamamoto believed that victory at Midway would provide him with a strategic edge that would allow Japan to negotiate from a position of strength, and thus force the enemy to come to terms. He was ever conscious of the latent power of the United States and Japan's relative weakness, and his absolute commitment to the Midway offensive was governed by the overwhelming conviction that, unless victory could be realized quickly and when Japanese power was at its zenith, the alternative for his beloved country was defeat in a long war. There can be little wonder that when faced with such awesome possibilities, he would brook no criticism or diversion from his chosen path. The Naval General Staff had also been reviewing options following the Army's veto on the Ceylon operation. From within the Plans Division, there emerged the view that combined fleet and the Army should concentrate on a major operation directed at Australia, the Ber Go Shaden Sakusen. This proposal was predicated on the assumption that Australia was the logical base for an Allied counter-offensive in the South Seas. As such, it would become the recipient of vast quantities of Allied and particularly American armaments as their forces built up their strength. To negate this potential threat to Japan's southern flank required either that parts of Australia should be occupied, or, at least, that steps be taken to isolate the subcontinent from the United States of America. As the former possibility depended on the Army stumping up the necessary divisions for the operation, it is not surprising that it, too, went the way of the Ceylon proposal. Even so, the Naval General Staff believed there was sufficient merit in the second proposal for it to proceed to formulate a more limited operation designed to isolate Australia by extending Japanese control over eastern New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The Naval General Staff proceeded to organize the necessary forces to launch an amphibious operation, code-named MO, to occupy the island of Tulagi in the Solomons and, more importantly, to seize Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea. To the naval forces earmarked for this operation, Yamamoto added Carrier Division 5, comprising the new fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, believing that the Americans would deploy a carrier task force to oppose the Japanese. As events were to show, Yamamoto was proffering a hostage to fortune, as the initial planning for the Midway operation presumed that these two vessels would be available to serve with the Nagumo force. By the end of March, the combined fleet plan for the Midway campaign was complete and had been presented to the Naval General Staff on the 2nd of April by Yamamoto's loyal and trusted aides, Captains Watanabe and Kuroshima. Over the next 3 days, there was much heated and fervent discussion, as these two officers debated the merit of the Midway operation with those in the Plans Division of the General Staff who opposed it. Matters came to a head on the 5th of April, when Watanabe restated Yamamoto's unambiguous support for the Midway operation by echoing his master's voice. In the last analysis, the success or failure of our entire strategy in the Pacific will be determined by whether or not we succeed in destroying the United States fleet, particularly its aircraft carriers. We believe that by launching the proposed operations against Midway, we can succeed in drawing out the enemy's carrier fleet and destroying it in decisive battle. If, on the other hand, the enemy should avoid our challenge, we shall still realize an important gain by advancing our defensive perimeter to Midway and the western Aleutians without obstruction. To emphasize his unwillingness to compromise, Yamamoto once again played his resignation gambit. In the face of Yamamoto's resolute stand, Rear Admiral Fukudome expressed the view, "If the Commander-in-Chief is so set on it, shall we leave it to him?" Nagano raised no objection, instructing a shift of resources to the Midway operation. Once the plan was adopted by the Naval General Staff, the Army, given how few troops it would be required to allocate, was more than happy to endorse Operations MI and AL, as the Midway and Aleutian offensives now became known, and thus also passed Imperial General Headquarters' scrutiny on the nod. There now only remained the debate concerning the details of the operation, with Combined Fleet wishing for the earliest practicable date and the Naval General Staff wishing for a delay. So matters continued until the 18th of April, when Jimmy Doolittle's B-25S roared over Tokyo, bringing further discussion to a rapid conclusion. It is apparent that, by this time, Japanese thinking had become afflicted by a canker so great that its effects may be found on every level of the planning and execution of the Midway operation, and which was to have a profound impact on the outcome of the battle. The emergence of what later became diagnosed as a victory disease had its origins in the unique quasi-mythological view the Japanese had of themselves and their nation, which they believed was destined to become Sekai Dai Ichi, or first in the world. The Japanese saw in the invulnerability of their sacred homeland evidence of their undisputed military effectiveness. Significantly, this and her successes in conflicts before the outbreak of the Pacific War were explained away in Japan less by reference to material and technical factors than by stressing the moral dimension in war. This engendered a mindset wherein it was believed that the Nihon Seishin, the innate Japanese spirit, would allow the nation to triumph over any enemy. For a Japan imbued with the martial virtues of the samurai tradition, the denigration of the United States as weak, decadent, and effete convinced many that there was little to fear in taking on this great Western power. This flawed perception of the United States fostered a profound underestimation of the immense military, industrial, and, indeed, moral potential of that nation, which in the longer term was to prove fatal for Japan. In the immediate circumstance, however, the remarkable victories of the opening 4 months of the Pacific War served only to compound the arrogant attitude of the Japanese towards their enemies, and by the time of the Midway battle, this arrogance had reached a point where it permeated the thinking and actions of officers and men in the fighting services. Directly arising from this, and affecting the highest echelons of the Navy, including Yamamoto himself, was the idea fixe that the Japanese possessed the undoubted initiative in the forthcoming operation. In consequence, it was presumed, to the point that it became an article of faith, that the United States fleet would put to sea only subsequent to the invasion and occupation of Midway. The notion that their carriers might be at sea awaiting the Japanese fleet, although recognized as a possibility, defied credulity. Indeed, when such a possibility was broached during the Midway War Games held on the Yamato between 1, the 4th of May, to explore the coming battle, the consequences of such an eventuality were dismissed in a remarkably cavalier fashion. Fuchida and Okumiya related how, when asked to explain how the first carrier striking force would deal with such an eventuality, Minoru Genda, the normally highly astute and level-headed aviation specialist, replied in such a vague fashion as to imply that there existed no plan to deal with such a contingency. Although Rear Admiral Ugaki remonstrated over the matter, he nevertheless revealed his own inner certainty of victory when, later in the games, he arbitrarily overturned the decision of the umpire who had ruled that the carriers Kaga and Akagi were sunk, so that only the former was dispatched while the latter emerged from battle with only light damage. Furthermore, as the games led on to explore the post-Midway operations, Kaga was miraculously resurrected from its watery grave. Other examples of this overweening optimism included the seaplane squadron that sent a remarkably careless signal to the effect that it wished all mail to be forwarded to Midway from mid-June. Possibly the most extreme example of this attitude was evidenced in a statement by a spokesman for the Naval General Staff, who contemptuously stated, "What we are most concerned about is that the enemy will be loath to meet our fleet and will refuse to come out from his base." Against this backdrop, preparations for the Midway and subsidiary Aleutians operations gained strength as April turned to May. The First Air Fleet had returned to Japan from their Indian Ocean venture on the 22nd of April to hear of the first news of MI and begin refurbishment and training for the operation. They were but 4 warships in an immense fleet of nearly 200 vessels assembled by Yamamoto for the Midway operation. By the mid-month, however, as the cost of the Battle of the Coral Sea became apparent, Nagumo knew that he would be taking 2 fewer fleet carriers with him to Midway than originally intended. For notwithstanding the great victory trumpeted by the Japanese media, the carrier Shokaku had been so severely damaged that her repairs would take many months to complete, and her sister ship Zuzukaku had lost so many of her aircrew that she could not take part in MI because of a lack of replacements. Although the Japanese regarded the setback of their naval attack on Port Moresby as a short-term frustration, their compensation lay in the conviction that they had imposed heavy losses on the Allied task forces. Certain enemy losses, proclaimed by the home media, included a Saratoga-class carrier, in reality the Lexington and the United States ship Yorktown. The latter, left sinking and later presumed sunk, was removed from Japan's estimate of the United States Navy's order of battle, but was to reappear barely a month later to make a significant contribution to the outcome of the Battle of Midway. Matters now began to move more quickly as the different elements in the Great Plan started to move in accordance with the complex timetable. On the 21st of May, Yamamoto led the battleships of his main body, Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers and Kondo's 2nd Fleet, to sea to begin 2 days of what would prove to be the final fleet maneuvers ever staged by the combined fleet. Final war games held on the Yamato on the 24th of May, rehearsing both the Midway and the Aleutians offensives, showed that operations would proceed smoothly. On the same day, the Midway invasion group of transports carrying the army attack troops of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki rendezvoused at Saipan with the heavy cruisers of Rear Admiral Kurita's support force. The forces earmarked for the AL operation made their way to the Ominato naval base in northern Honshu before sorting on the 28th of May. All was now ready for the departure of the largest assemblage of vessels ever seen in the Pacific. For those aboard the many ships of the Armada, there was little doubt of the momentous nature of the occasion. Shortly after 8, on the morning of the 28th of May, the Akagi struck the signal flag ordering the First Air Fleet to up anchor and sortie as planned. To the accompaniment of the cheers and the myriad waving caps of the crews of the battleships of Yamamoto's main body, the 21 warships wound their way in line ahead through the Bungo Channel and out into the open sea. No better insight into the sense of invincibility now pervading the Nagumo force can be offered than the final intelligence assessment which the commanding admiral presented to his crews as they were preparing to close on Midway Island some days later. The enemy is unaware of our presence in this area and will remain so until after our initial attacks on the island. Yamamoto and Nagumo were sure that they would achieve tactical, if not strategic, surprise, but they would not have been so sanguine had they known that the Americans had wind of the Midway operation as early as the beginning of April. Although there were suspicions, it was only after the war that the Japanese would discover for certain that Operation MI had been fatally compromised as a consequence of a remarkable American intelligence coup that gave them detailed knowledge of the Japanese plan. While many other factors were to come into play before victory was delivered to the Americans at Midway, none ranks so high as the breaking of JN25, the Japanese Navy's current operational code. Although this was a remarkable achievement, the code was not understood in its entirety. Nevertheless, sufficient phrases could be read to allow Commander Joseph Rochefort, commander of the Navy Combat Intelligence Office outstation on Hawaii, known as HIPO, to inform Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz that the Japanese were preparing a very large operation which he was convinced was directed at Midway. Although the intelligence was initially ambiguous enough to allow for other interpretations of Japanese intentions, Nimitz was sufficiently convinced of the case presented by Rochefort to start planning on the basis that Midway was the Japanese target. He had already learned to value Rochefort's judgment, having won his spurs in April, when, on the basis of his existing intelligence, he had forecast the Japanese operation to take Port Moresby. By acting on this and other intelligence sources, Nimitz had dispatched Task Forces 11 and 17 which, for the loss of the Lexington, stopped the southwards advance of the combined fleet. On the 2nd of May, Nimitz made an inspection tour of Midway Island. Although at this juncture he did not enlighten either Lieutenant Commander Shannon or Commander Cyril Simard, the 2 senior officers in command there, as to his suspicions, he did ascertain from them what would be needed to hold off a major amphibious attack. On his return to Pearl Harbor, he penned them a letter to the effect that the Japanese intended to launch a major attack on Midway Island on or about the 28th of May. Subsequently, manpower and air power on the atoll base was increased to a level that Shannon believed sufficient to hold out against any amphibious attack. Within a few days, however, Nimitz was presented with vital intelligence which established beyond doubt that Midway, and not Hawaii or the eastern coast of the United States, was the objective of the coming Japanese offensive. He was thus able to declare on the 14th of May a state of fleet opposed invasion for the Hawaii area including Midway. Once again it was Hypo and the resourceful Commander Rochefort who provided him with confirming evidence of enemy intentions. The clinch came as the result of a ruse by Rochefort. In their interbase communications, the Japanese used code letters to designate what were clearly locations, but which code for which location. From other information appended to the code, it was inferred that the use of AL, for instance, was a reference to the Aleutians. But AF was less certain. although Rochefort was sure it was Midway. To flush out the Japanese, Rochefort secured permission from Nimitz for a message to be sent in plain English from Midway, reporting that there was a water shortage on the island. As the island lacked any natural water supply, its occupants were dependent upon a water filtration plant that was reported as having blown up. The request for fresh water to be delivered by tanker would thus ring true to Japanese eavesdroppers, for whose benefit the false message was dispatched. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, the Hypo team were rewarded by the Japanese broadcasting to their own fleet commanders that AF is short of water. Notwithstanding the niggles that continued to come from Admiral King in Washington concerning the likely target of the Japanese attack, Nimitz was now convinced beyond any doubt that Midway was truly the objective of Yamamoto's massive enterprise. He proceeded to harness his own limited air and naval assets to frustrate Japanese intentions. On the 15th of May, Vice Admiral William Halsey, commander of Task Force 16, comprising the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, was recalled by Nimitz to Pearl Harbor from the vicinity of the Solomon Islands, where he had arrived too late to take part in the Coral Sea battle. Nimitz had intended to give command of the Midway task force to Halsey, but on the latter's return to Pearl on the 26th, it was clear that his very poor physical condition precluded this. A chronic skin complaint diagnosed as general dermatitis denied a deeply disappointed Halsey the opportunity to take his major crack at the Japanese. However, he served Nimitz and his country proud when he unhesitatingly recommended that his replacement be Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Although he was not an airman, both Halsey and Nimitz held the man in very high regard, and neither had any compunction about placing Task Force 16 in his hands. In his initial briefing with him, Nimitz told Spruance that he would need to sortie on the 28th, as some days earlier, Rochefort and his Hypo team had informed him of the coming Midway offensive, and stated that the Japanese had postponed D-Day until the 3rd of June at the earliest. This was only part of a much larger message that Hypo had deciphered just before the Japanese changed the JN25 code, which revealed itself to be nothing more than the principal details of their order of battle for the coming operation. In consequence, Nimitz was able to tell Spruance more or less exactly what he was up against, and the general direction from which the Japanese carriers would be approaching Midway. Nimitz was thus in a position to present to Spruance his operational plan for the task forces 16 and 17, predicated on the intelligence provided by Hypo. The following day, Nimitz also met with Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, who had just brought the heavily damaged Yorktown limping back into Pearl. Without revealing his sources, Nimitz informed him of the Japanese intention to seize Midway Island, and said that they would be employing at least 4 carriers and many supporting vessels in the operation organized into Nagumo's carrier strike force, a support force and the invasion force. Nimitz then told Fletcher that he would be putting to sea again in the Yorktown within a few days to join up with Spruance to the northeast of Midway Island, whereupon he would assume tactical command of task forces 16 and 17. However, this presupposed that the Yorktown would be sufficiently repaired to be able to sortie on time. Many who surveyed her damage doubted that it could be done. Estimates of time needed for repairs ranged from a pessimistic 3 months to Fletcher's own more optimistic prediction of a fortnight. If the latter figure was correct, Yorktown would not be available for the coming battle, and Spruance would face Nagumo with 2 rather than 3 carriers, not a wide enough margin to encourage hopes of success. In a remarkable demonstration of American improvisation, the carrier was taken into dry dock, where some 1,400 dockyard workers descended upon the vessel en masse and set to preparing her for sea, working round the clock. To the sound of pneumatic hammers, and by the light of welders' torches, the Yorktown's hull was patched up, and her damaged compartments strengthened with timbers. Few of the watertight doors worked owing to frames being buckled by Japanese bomb damage, but on Saturday, the 29th of May, the day after Spruance had sailed with Task Force 16, Fletcher put to sea in the Yorktown. Her hastily assembled air group comprised squadrons from no fewer than 3 carriers. Along with her escorts, the heavy cruisers Astoria and Portland and the 6 destroyers of Desron II, the Yorktown moved north from Oahu at a stately 27 knots, the highest speed her damaged engines could produce, to rendezvous with Enterprise and Hornet. Barring any unforeseen eventuality, Fletcher felt confident he could satisfy Nimitz's heartfelt exhortation that Task Forces 16 and 17 rendezvous to the northeast of Midway on time. The aims governing Operations AL and MI were twofold. First, to establish a new forward defence line running from the Aleutians through Midway, Wake Island, the Marshalls, the Gilbert Islands and the Southern Solomons to Port Moresby, and secondly, and more importantly, to effect the destruction of the remaining surface units of the United States fleet in that a decisive fleet engagement in the Pacific, or Kasan Kantai, so dear to the hearts of Japanese naval strategists. This was to be precipitated by the invasion and occupation of the island of Midway, a base the Japanese believed to be of such strategic importance to the United States Navy that it would be forced to sortie from Hawaii with the remaining warships of the Pacific Fleet to challenge Japan's occupation of it. Certain of realizing at least tactical surprise and disposing of an overwhelming superiority in warships, Combined Fleet was confident of a decisive victory in the naval battle that would follow. To achieve this end, Combined Fleet had formulated a complex and critically timed plan involving a two-pronged offensive. The execution of the different phases of both offensives turned on the 7th of June, designated as N-Day, the Japanese equivalent of the United States D-Day. This had been chosen by Combined Fleet as the earliest practicable date that would allow the Nagumo fleet to recuperate following its return to Japan from its Indian Ocean operation, as well as being last the day in June when there would be sufficient moonlight to allow an amphibious landing on Midway Island at night. The first and lesser of the two offensives, codenamed AL, was a diversionary operation against the Aleutian Islands in the northern Pacific. The brief given to Vice Admiral Hosogaya for AL required the neutralization of United States air power at Dutch Harbor beginning on the 3rd of June, 3 days before N-Day, followed by the occupation over a succession of days of the islands of Adak, Kiska and Attu through to the 12th of June. Forces allocated to AL included Northern Force Main Body, the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, the Attu and Kiska Invasion Forces, and a submarine unit detached to assist the Aleutians operation. In addition, Combined Fleet had allocated, as a detachment from Yamamoto's main body, a screening force of battleships for the Aleutian operation under the command of Vice Admiral Takasu. Whereas the latter would sortie from the main fleet anchorage in Hashirajima Bay, along with the rest of the main body under Yamamoto on the 29th of May, the others would depart from the Ominato naval base in northern Honshu a day earlier. The MI operation fell into two distinct phases, with the participating fleet elements all playing their role according to a very tightly orchestrated timetable. Phase 1 involved the occupation of Midway Island itself on N-Day. Thereafter, it was presumed that the disposition of the fleet would be such as to place the Japanese in the most advantageous position to effect the destruction of the United States fleet elements that were bound to sortie once news of Midway's fall reached Hawaii. The very large number of vessels employed in this operation, coupled with the need to ensure surprise, led to a wide dispersal of the forces involved. The plan made provision for the attack on Midway to be initiated by Admiral Nagumo's 1st Carrier Air Fleet on the 5th of June, N-2. Approaching from the northwest, his 4 carriers were to launch their aircraft some 250 miles from Midway, and then proceed to attack the atoll base, eliminating enemy air power on the island and softening up the defences in readiness for the landings. Having fulfilled this task, Nagumo's carriers would then be free to tackle the United States carriers and other vessels it was presumed would sortie from Pearl Harbor following the fall of Midway. Provision of air support for the actual landings on the 7th of June was to be provided by roof floatplane fighters of Rear Admiral Fujita's Seaplane Tender Group, who, on N-1, would seize the island of Kure barely 60 miles from Midway as a forward operating base. This was but the prelude to the amphibious landings to be made at dawn on the 7th of June by the Midway Invasion Force, which was coming up on the island from the south and carrying the Army's only contribution to the offensive in the form of the Ichiki Detachment. The plan allowed for the discovery by the Americans of Tanaka's invasion force on the 6th of June, D1, so that they would be led to believe that the main Japanese attack was coming from the south. The landings on Sand Island and Eastern Island would be given close support by the 8-inch gun batteries of Vice Admiral Kurita's 4 heavy cruisers. Lying further to the south and protecting the flank of the invasion force would be Kondo's main body, By end day, Admiral Yamamoto's main body, comprising the combined fleet's most powerful battleships, and including the flagship Yamato, and of whose presence the United States Navy was unaware of until after the battle, would lie some 500 miles to the northwest of the island, along with other fleet elements already mentioned, ready to initiate the most important phase of Operation MI. This would occur when long-range air reconnaissance and the two submarine cordons stationed between Hawaii and Midway, planned to be on station on the 2nd of June, informed Yamamoto that the United States fleet had sortied from Pearl. Rapidly concentrating his widely dispersed forces, Yamamoto would then force the decisive battle on the United States fleet, from which the Japanese had no doubt they would emerge victorious, the coup de grace being delivered by the heavy guns of the battleships. There were those among the Japanese, however, who expressed concern over the very tight timetable imposed on Nagumo's carriers. They believed that it placed a potentially dead hand on his freedom of movement by requiring him to reconcile two opposing objectives, destruction of Midway's air power and the defeat of the United States carriers, thus severely limiting his ability to respond in the face of an unexpected contingency. However, this was a minority view, and the prevailing sentiment was that all would be well, provided the United States Navy responded exactly as the Japanese predicted. Given the poverty of combined fleet's knowledge of the whereabouts of the United States Pacific Fleet, the presumed certainty of its position and reaction contained within this rigid plan is quite remarkable. In the end, it was to prove to be its undoing. Indeed, the last reliable sighting of United States warships had occurred as far back as the 18th of May, when a number were spotted from the air to the east of the Solomon Islands. The estimate of United States strength that Yamamoto had issued on the 20th of May, covering the Aleutians, Hawaii, and Midway, although not accurate, did draw attention to the strength of the Midway defences, reinforcing the necessity for heavy air attacks to be launched on the 5th of June from Nagumo's carriers. He estimated the strength of United States fleet assets in the Hawaii area as 2 or 3 carriers, 2 or 3 escort carriers, 4 or 5 heavy cruisers, 3 or 4 light cruisers, and about 30 destroyers and 25 submarines. To illustrate the paucity of real knowledge of the position of the United States fleet, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo was of the opinion that a United States carrier task force was operating far to the south in the Solomons, providing evidence to their mind that the Americans were unaware of Japanese intentions. Yamamoto's own attempts to acquire more definitive intelligence about the shipping at Pearl came to naught when planned overflights of the harbour by 2 Kawanishi H-8 Kemily flying boats between the 31st of May and the 3rd of June were cancelled, because submarine I-123 reported that U.S. ships were patrolling their designated mid-flight refueling stop at the French frigate Shoals. Nor did the submarine cordons have better luck. By the time they came on station, which was 2 days later than the planned D-5, Spruance had already passed by some days before, and Yorktown slipped through the cordon without detection. Nevertheless, the Japanese did have indications that all might not be as they believed. On the 1st of June, Ugaki observed in his diary, "Out of 180 radio exchanges observed in the Hawaii district, as many as 72 were tagged urgent. We believe that the enemy are preparing to meet us after having strongly suspected our movement." This vital information was denied to Nagumo by the erroneous belief of those on board Yamato that this radio traffic must surely have been picked up on Akagi, and that Nagumo would, in consequence, take appropriate action. This position was adhered to in spite of their knowledge that Akagi's radio facilities were deficient. As it was, the American radio traffic was not picked up on the Akagi. On this presumption, it was argued there was no need to break the blanket radio silence Yamamoto had imposed upon the operation before the landings. For that same reason, an updated and highly revealing message sent by the Naval General Staff on the 2nd of June, speculating about the possible presence of a United States carrier force in the eastern Midway area lying in wait to ambush the advancing Japanese, was not passed on to Nagumo. Deprived of the information that could have significantly changed the outcome of the events now about to unfold, Nagumo continued to plunge towards Midway, in possession of an intelligence picture almost as impenetrable as the fog banks through which his carriers were now moving. The plan that Nimitz presented to Spruance and Fletcher on the 27th of May had been formulated on the presumed accuracy of the most up-to-date intelligence picture of Japanese intentions and dispositions. Nimitz had already decided that the Aleutian operation was a diversion, but had nevertheless dispatched Task Force 8 under Rear Admiral Theobald to the Aleutians with 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers, the most he could spare. Midway figured prominently in Nimitz's planning by functioning as a 4th unsinkable aircraft carrier. While total air power on the island was raised to 115 aircraft of differing types, by the 3rd of June, Nimitz was fully aware that the relative obsolescence of many of these precluded any possibility of preventing repeated raids on the atoll base by Nagumo's aircraft. Under such circumstances, he recognized that the only way Midway could maximize the limited capabilities of the air power it possessed would be to inflict prompt and early damage to Japanese carrier flight decks, in the hope of catching their aircraft before they took off. He therefore instructed the air commander that the fighters on Midway should be employed to escort the bombers and not to defend the airbase. That task should be left to the anti-aircraft guns. He also expected that the long-range air patrols flown by PBY-5As from the island, beginning as early as the 22nd of May, would serve as the eyes of Midway and of the carrier task forces, and that first contact with the approaching Japanese forces would be made by them. However, with the exception of Shannon, Simard, and a few other higher ranks, Nimitz had not revealed that the efforts of the defending Midway forces would be supported by the Navy's carriers. There was no attempt to coordinate the efforts of 38 PBY-5 and PBY-5 Catalina, Army, Navy, and Marine Air units on Midway itself, or to coordinate them with the Navy forces at sea. Indeed, Navy pilots on the island were told quite specifically that the carrier's first priority was to protect Pearl Harbor, inferring their absence from Midway's defense when the Japanese attacked. Nothing could be permitted that would in any way compromise the absolute secrecy of the presence of the carriers to the northeast of Midway Island, for Nimitz was depending on the aircraft spotted on their decks for a successful outcome in the days ahead. For added security, Nimitz pulled back some 19 submarines from their offensive duties, and for the duration of the battle allocated 16 of them the defensive task of screening Midway. Another 4 covered Oahu, leaving 3 available on call. The principal target of U.S. action, however, was beyond dispute. It was Nagumo's 4 carriers, known to be approaching Midway from the northwest. Nimitz pronounced to Fletcher and Spruance that, in seeking their destruction, it was absolutely vital for the United States carriers to achieve surprise by hitting them first and from the flank. The overwhelming Japanese material superiority over the United States Navy precluded any option other than a savage and devastating hit-and-run strike. Because surprise and speed were the essence of his plan, Nimitz had consciously eschewed the employment of the slow battleships of Task Force 1, based in San Francisco. Given how few were the naval assets now possessed by the United States Navy in the Pacific, the option of a drawn-out battle of attrition was not a possibility. If Fletcher and Spruance failed and the United States carriers were sunk, the whole of the Pacific and the eastern seaboard of the United States would lay open to the Japanese. Nimitz could not fail to impress upon his subordinates that their actions, in the light of these facts, must be guided by the principle of calculated risk. Fletcher and Spruance were to engage only if they had a good chance of inflicting disproportionate damage on the Japanese. Despite the remarkable intelligence provided by Hypo, Nimitz knew that the operation they had embarked upon was a very great gamble. A great deal could go wrong. Certainly the battle was not in the bag. Little wonder, then, that he named the rendezvous point of the 3 United States carriers at 32 degrees north latitude, 173 degrees west longitude, and 325 miles to the northeast of Midway Point Luck. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto emerges from any account of the Midway operation as the central and supreme moving force on the Japanese side. It has already been shown how this arose as a consequence of his dominance within the combined fleet and over the senior officers of the Naval General Staff. In reality, the Midway plan was his, and when it failed and failed totally, he made no attempt to shift the blame to a convenient scapegoat. Post-battle analysis by the Japanese was to reveal a host of shortcomings regarding the operation, but strangely enough, these seem never to have coloured their own assessment of Admiral Yamamoto as a military commander of the First Order. Perhaps the key to the failure of Operation MI lies in the temperament of the combined fleet commander. A patriot to his fingertips, he was nevertheless all too aware that Japan's Pacific War was, above all, a reckless gamble. As an inveterate gambler himself, whether at poker or shogi, he had perhaps persuaded himself that the only possibility for his homeland's survival lay in an operation in which everything had to be staked on one card. This might explain not only his almost pathological insistence on the speed with which MI was carried out, but also the reckless commitment of resources to the vast Midway enterprise without a detailed, up-to-the-minute intelligence appraisal of the strength and disposition of the United States fleet. Without doubt, his unwillingness to brook any opposition to Operation MI was driven as much by his own awareness of America's inevitable recovery as it was by his very genuine sense of failure, perhaps even of personal dishonor, in having allowed the Emperor's person to have been threatened by the Doolittle raid. His great reputation, particularly in Japan, rests on the claim that he was a pioneer in the development of naval air power. While it is true that he did oversee a major expansion of this arm of the Rengo Kantai, there are more than a few pointers in the period between Pearl Harbor and the execution of Operation MI to suggest that, at a more fundamental level, he had not grasped the full implications of the truly radical change that air power had wrought on naval warfare. This can perhaps be inferred from his readiness to comply with the breaking up of the First Air Fleet following the Pearl Harbor attack, as if he were unaware of the revolutionary nature of that unique formation. It is also implicit in the highly convoluted nature of the plan for Operation MI, which turned on the denouement of the United States Pacific Fleet in the Kantai-Kessen, wherein the ruin of American warships would be brought about not by the aircraft of Nagumo's carriers, but by the L-6-inch and 18-inch guns of Yamamoto's inappropriately named main body of battleships. Clearly, the carriers were seen to have a vital role, but as understudies to the battle wagons. Additionally, the dispersion of the very large number of warships assembled for MI, whilst ostensibly serving the need for surprise and security, actually contributed to the very dissipation of the mass required for the decisive battle. Vital assets like the carriers Ryujo and Junyo were wasted in the diversionary Aleutians operation, which failed totally in its purpose. The dispersion also deprived Nagumo's carriers of the myriad anti-aircraft batteries aboard the many cruisers and battleships that would have greatly assisted the flat-tops in fighting off the United States air attacks. Such a proposal to reorganize the combined fleet around 3 carrier groups in a manner analogous to the United States Navy task forces was argued for by Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi in the wake of the Coral Sea battle, but was not acted upon in time for Midway. To have acceded to this position would have marked the final subservience of the battleship to naval air power in the Rengo Kantat. However, it was to take the shattering defeat at Midway for the big-gun capital ship advocates to accept that change. Comment has also often been made on the dead hand placed on MI, once it had begun, by Yamamoto's anachronistic decision to go to sea himself. He should have stayed at Hashirajima, as Nimitz did at Oahu, so that he could marshal and command his forces in response to intelligence. Once at sea, as we shall observe shortly, the very radio silence he imposed on the fleet to ensure tactical surprise was also imposed on himself, totally negating any value in his presence at sea. Much more questionable, particularly when it was within his power to do something about it, was Yamamoto's continued retention of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo as commander of the First Air Fleet. There can be no doubting the excellent service record of this torpedo specialist who had commanded cruisers and battleships, but his appointment to command this formation was a most unlikely choice, given his complete lack of experience with naval air power. Indeed, it was said of him by a close service colleague that he had no real conception of the power or potentialities of the naval air arm. His appointment was not by design, but was the consequence of seniority and protocol which required his filling the post when it fell vacant. Although Yamamoto expressed a degree of unhappiness about Nagumo's performance at Pearl Harbor, he was not prepared to replace him because it is said that he feared Nagumo would take his loss of command as a personal dishonor and revert to self-annihilation. Nonetheless, Nagumo was undoubtedly the most successful carrier admiral in the world at the time of the Midway battle. Besides Pearl Harbor, Nagumo's carriers had rampaged through the South Seas and the Indian Ocean, and the sense of invincibility engendered by these victories certainly put Nagumo in a most optimistic state of mind on the eve of Midway. Even so, he was to make a number of major errors in the battle, such as the inadequate air search procedures that, in hindsight, were not insignificant in bringing about the Japanese defeat, even though such decisions appeared both logical and sound at the time. There is a real sense in which the main United States commanders in the battle revealed a degree of professional realism and objectivity that sets them apart from their Japanese counterparts. Without doubt, the most remarkable was Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Once he had taken on the mantle of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, his personable style of man management rapidly raised morale in the wake of Pearl Harbor. The preparation for Midway showed his remarkable gift for trusting colleagues to employ their expertise, and then to act upon their ideas when he was convinced they were right. In particular, his willingness to take seriously the views and judgments of Commander Rochefort, and to trust them even when his own superior, Admiral King, did not, was absolutely crucial. His deployment of his own limited naval assets was based on his conviction that Rochefort's intelligence was accurate. Admiral King certainly fretted over Nimitz's judgments concerning Japan's likely intentions before Midway. He was acutely aware that his Pacific admiral was in a position analogous to that of Jellicoe at Jutland, as being the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. However, the fate of the United States Navy could not have been in better hands. Chester Nimitz never ceased to pay tribute to the crucial role played in the battle by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, frequently stating that it was he who was really responsible for the victory at Midway. Given that Spruance was not a carrier admiral and had only been drafted in at the last moment because of Bull Halsey's dermatitis, this is high praise indeed. Some have rated Spruance's appointment as Nimitz's most important command decision of the battle. While he never denigrated Halsey's own particular leadership skills, Nimitz insisted that Spruance's analytical intellect and calm and collective disposition made him absolutely right for the peculiar conditions of the Midway battle. In later years, Nimitz, reflecting upon the happy role played by fate in causing Spruance to be appointed to the command of Task Force 16, said, "It was a great day for the Navy when Bill Halsey had to enter the hospital." Although he always consciously eschewed the publicity that Halsey loved, Spruance generated a reputation that in the end was totally grounded on his professionalism. However, he was never in any doubt as to where the credit for Midway lay. He laid it firmly at the feet of Nimitz as the one who had the courage to accept the intelligence picture and act upon it. Although Admiral Frank Fletcher played a crucial part in the victory of Midway, he tends to stand in the shadows of his nominal subordinate Raymond Spruance and his superior Admiral Nimitz. His performance in the Coral Sea exposed him to criticism, but he incorporated his experiences of that battle into his tactics at Midway. Of particular importance was his decision to separate the two task groups so that they would not provide the Japanese with one target had all three carriers operated in close proximity. The consequences of operating thus was to become abundantly clear to the Japanese before very long. Furthermore, letting Spruance lead off against the Japanese carriers on the 4th of June inevitably meant that he would acquire the kudos for delivering the first blow. That he knowingly sacrificed this personal prestige for the sake of operational effectiveness has been held by many to be the measure of the man. The most visible and potent symbol of Japanese military prowess in the first 6 months of the Pacific War was the Mitsubishi A-6M20 Sen carrier fighter. This was a remarkable compromise of a clean, lightweight airframe, conveying great maneuverability allied to very long range and heavy firepower. Ever since Pearl Harbor, the Zero had swept Allied air power from the skies wherever it had been encountered, generating a reputation that by the time of Midway verged on the mythical. Only after recovering an almost intact example that had crashed in the Aleutians during Operation AL were the Americans able to divine the Achilles heel of this outstanding aircraft. Nevertheless, it was the air superiority gained by this fighter, flown by highly skilled and experienced aircrew such as Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya of the Akagi, that had enabled the dive bomber and torpedo bomber squadrons of the Rengo Kantai to employ their fearful expertise against Allied sea and land targets. In the Aichi D-3 A1 Val dive bomber, the Japanese possessed an effective design which, in the hands of expert pilots, had realized a strike accuracy of 80% against Royal Navy warships during the rampage across the Indian Ocean in April 1942. Although it was a large machine with a fixed, spatted undercarriage, the Val had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for dogfighting in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Two examples of the D-3A1A's replacement, the Yokosuka D-4Y1 Judy, were present at Midway aboard the carrier Soryu for employment as reconnaissance aircraft. The Nakajima B-5N2 Kate, of which 93 equipped the torpedo bombing squadrons of Nagumo's carriers in June 1942, was the best aircraft of its type in the world, outmatching its American and British equivalents. However, its superior performance was only relative, for like all aircraft of its type, its large size, slow speed and poor armament made it vulnerable to fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire. Nevertheless, its achievements during the period to Midway had been remarkable. It was also employed in the level bombing role in the attack on Midway Island, as well as in its principal role of torpedo bomber in the attacks on the United States carriers. In spite of the technical proficiency of its aircraft, by the time of Midway a major problem had begun to emerge for the Japanese naval air arm, which was undoubtedly to have an influence on the outcome of the battle and was to handicap them dramatically throughout the rest of the war. Unlike most of the battleships of the combined fleet, which had resided in majestic splendor at the Hashirajima anchorage since the outbreak of war, the carriers of the First Air Fleet had been in almost continual action since Pearl Harbor. As a result, the inevitable attrition had begun to make dangerous inroads into aircrew numbers. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with a fairly small pool of 5,000 pilots, of which some 3,500 were serving frontline flyers. Owing to the policy of retaining the expertise in frontline squadrons to ensure a qualitative advantage in combat, very few of these veterans survived to pass on their expertise to the new replacement aircrew training in Japan. Thus, most, if not all, replacement aircrew were rank novices needing a great deal of time and effort to work up to even minimal combat efficiency. The fallacy of this policy became apparent after the Coral Sea, when the losses of irreplaceable veteran aircrew, such as Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, who had led the dive bombers at Pearl Harbor, resulted in the new fleet carrier Zuikaku being withdrawn from Operation MI because of a lack of trained aircrew. Indeed, Nagumo was to comment unfavorably on the poor quality of many of the replacement crews dispatched to serve on the carriers. As we shall see, the growing crisis in the supply of aircrew was only compounded for the Japanese by the grievous losses they were to sustain among the remaining veteran aircrew at Midway. In the coming battle, which would be waged by aircraft against each other and by aircraft against warships, the actual number available to the United States aboard their carriers and based on Midway Island itself provided them with a small margin of 23 aircraft, more than the 325 aboard the Japanese carriers. However, the numbers game counted for little in these circumstances, as every United States type employed in the battle was inferior to its Japanese counterpart to a greater or lesser degree. Whilst the main Navy fighter, the F-4 Wildcat, was inferior to the Zero, United States pilots had learnt through bitter experience the tactics necessary to take on their more maneuverable opponent. Whenever possible, the F-4S would dive on the Zeros, using the fire from their 6 machine guns to destroy the lightly loaded and unarmoured airframe of the Japanese fighter. Where dogfighting could not be avoided, the Wildcat had shown itself able to take on the Zero. United States Navy pilots were highly trained in deflection shooting, and their reflector gun sights offered accurate gunnery, which allowed a high probability of lethal hits. The presence of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks also enabled the portly Wildcat to take the sort of damage that would destroy a Zero Sen and still return to its carrier. The F-4F was the mount of Lieutenant Commander John Sajimi Thash, who at Midway commanded the composite fighter squadron composed of the Saratoga's VF-3 and Yorktown's VF-5. His experience fighting the Zero Sen had led to his formulation of a new tactic that took his name, the Thach Weave, which he and VF-3 employed with success in the Battle of Midway. Although the Douglas SBD Dauntless was regarded by the Navy as obsolete by the time of Midway, it was in all probability one of the best dive bombers in the world at the time. Its virtue lay in its great stability and light control responses. At Midway, it was to prove to be the real destroyer of the Japanese carriers when, at the end of its rock-steady dive at an optimum angle of 80 degrees, it was to deposit its 1,000-pound explosives deep in the vitals of the enemy vessels. It was, however, the torpedo bomber pilots who flew the most decidedly obsolescent of the major United States Navy types employed in the Midway battle. The TBD-1 Devastator had been designed as far back as 1934. In 1937, when it first entered service with the Navy, it was the best of its type in the world, but by 1942 it was totally outmoded. At the time of Midway, however, it was the only torpedo bomber the Navy possessed in any numbers because its replacement, the Grumman TBF-1, was not yet available in sufficient quantities. Indeed, the 21 crews from Hornet's Torpedo Bombing Squadron 8, VT-8, who had been converting to the new aeroplane in the United States, arrived at Pearl one day after the Hornet had departed for Midway. Not only were the torpedo bombing crews thus condemned to fly against the Japanese carriers in an aeroplane that was laboriously slow and had a poor rate of climb, but they were also forearmed with the knowledge that its poor performance in its designated role was compounded by the ignominious reputation of its nominated main weapon, the unreliable Mark 13 torpedo. Its record at Midway was one of glorious failure for, as we shall see, it was the sacrifice of the TBD crews that opened the roof for the dive bombers to destroy the Japanese carriers. Whereas the Navy at least was flying some modern types, Marine Corps Air Group 22 on Midway itself was operating decidedly obsolete Navy hand-me-downs in the form of Brewster F-2 A-3 Buffalo fighters, nicknamed Flying Coffins, and Vought SB-2 U-3 Vindicator dive bombers. The latter were disparagingly nicknamed vibrators by their pilots, and had the disconcerting habit of shedding their wing fabric, which was repaired by the liberal application of sticky tape. Some new equipment was available in the form of 7 F-4 F-3AS, serving alongside the Buffaloes of VMF 221, and some 16 SBDs operating with the Vindicators of VMSB 241. In the case of the latter, their potential effectiveness was offset by the Marine pilots' virtual lack of flying experience on the type. To beef up Marine air power on the island, both the Army and the Navy dispatched a hodgepodge of types. The Army sent a detachment of its 7th Army Air Force, made up of 19 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 4 of the new B-26 Marauder medium bombers, equipped to carry single torpedoes under their fuselages. Much was expected of the former type, but its contribution to the battle was negligible, in spite of the great amount of space it took up on the small Eastern Island Air Base and the prodigious quantities of fuel used in the B-17 sorties. Offensive Navy air assets on the island were confined to 6 of the TBFs from VT-8 that had arrived at Pearl on the 29th of May. From among the crews that had disembarked with the new aeroplanes, 6 were selected to fly out to Midway, arriving on the 1st of June. Most important of all the aircraft types based on Midway were the Navy PBY-5 and 5A Catalina amphibious flying boats of Patrol Wings 1 and 2. They had the vital role of searching out and reporting on the advancing Japanese forces, and by the 30th of May no fewer than 24 PBYs were sweeping a huge arc from the north-northeast to the south-southwest of Midway out to a distance of 700 miles.